having fun. Again, this is a mark time measure of success for a lot of people, African Americans, women included. But Roaring Twenties, it's really a story of going from the top to, in many ways, the bottom. Boundaries were crossed and even shattered during the 1920s. Mass media helped usher in the new era. In 1920, more Americans lived in urban cities than in the country. In New York City, for example, those who lived on Park and Fifth Avenue were among the wealthiest. They had lavish parties and dressed in the finest clothes. America had entered a time of endless prosperity, or so it seemed. Societal norms were challenged in several ways during the new era. The 18th Amendment forbade the sale of and manufacture and consumption of alcohol. However, a large number of Americans found other ways to get a cold one. People went to speakeasies and or bought alcohol from bootleggers. One New York socialite remembered being served orange blossoms, which is gin and orange juice. The 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, gave women the right to vote. Women found themselves having more freedom than ever before. Flappers were women who wore short dresses, cut their hair in bobs, and challenged boundaries. Vamps were women who had no boundaries. During this time, women could decide if they wanted to marry or have a career. For many, marriage was about romantic interests now, not mere convenience. During the 1920s, African American culture saw a new celebration of music, literature, and more in Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance placed notable people like jazz greats Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, blues queen Bessie Smith, prolific poet Langston Hughes in the spotlight. New York was the most racially, ethnically mixed area in the U.S. at this time. Marcus Garvey, born in Jamaica, led a Pan-African movement in the United States. He believed that all people of African descent had a common heritage, culture, purpose, and goal. Garvey called for Black Americans to return to their ancestral home, Africa. Although it is true African Americans endured discrimination in society and had common goals, the majority of them had no real knowledge of Africa. They were Americanized, and most could not point on a map which African country their ancestors were from. Garvey also encouraged African Americans to build their own businesses and be business minded. He started the Black Star Line cruise ship, which initially had some success. So, interesting side note, Malcolm X's father, Earl Little, was a Baptist minister who supported Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement. Okay, so new technologies transformed daily life. The automobile revolutionized America. It gave people a sense of freedom also. Work, family, courtship were all impacted. One could drive to the city for work. In addition, families could visit each other more often. Dating became more private and intimate because of the automobile. Young couples did not have to court each other under the watchful eye of parents on a porch. Instead, couples now drove through the countryside to go sightseeing and enjoy true alone time. In the 1920s, the government spent more than $1 billion on roads, highways, bridges, and tunnels. The radio began as a hobby, but soon became the instrument of mass communication. It was the source of news, entertainment, public service announcements, education, politics, and it brought people closer together. Americans had a shared experience through radio listening. A number of citizens started to confront long-held religious beliefs. In Dayton, Tennessee in 1925, John T. Scopes taught Darwin's theory of evolution, despite the fact that Tennessee had outlawed teaching anything about Darwin. There was a clash between modernity, or the modern society, and traditional values. Folks who dwelled in small towns often felt their values were being attacked and their way of life threatened. The KKK capitalized on these fears. So KKK membership actually soared in the 1920s to 4 million. A judge, Jake Holy of Alabama, stated, the Ku Klux Klan opposed blacks, Catholics, and Jews. His words. They would go to people's houses and whip folks. Lillian Hall Gerdau remembered her father being invited to become a member of the KKK, but he refused. A few days later, a few KKK members burned a cross across the street from their home. Lillian's mother said it was as if they were guarding the gates of hell. The KKK gained support throughout the country. In 1930, in Marion, Indiana, that is, a KKK-inspired mob led 3 black young men to be hanged. They were accused of killing a white couple. James Cameron, one of the 3, maintained his innocence as a noose was placed around his neck. Just before he was hanged, a voice shouted, "He's innocent! That boy didn't have anything to do with those murders." James was released, thank goodness. His friends, Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith, weren't so fortunate. Okay, the blue skies of the 1920s, right? And we're saying blue skies, but obviously there were some dark elements to the 1920s as well, like we just mentioned the KKK. But those blue skies, right, from the 20s did not last. President Herbert Hoover stated America was on its way to riches. Sadly, that was not the case. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Investors cashed in overpriced stock. A panic of selling started. More than $30 billion in paper value vanished as the stock market crashed. Some people lost every penny and had no pension and no benefits. Others jumped from the George Washington Bridge too deep into despair to attempt to start over. Bank robberies increased during the 1930s. Desperate men like Pretty Boy Floyd and John Dillinger were seen as Robin Hood types, taking from the rich to give to the poor. Many once prosperous farmers found themselves starving and in need of help. Clement Harris, an independent journalist, tells of a woman who had the gas man come to her house. He was instructed to cut off her service. The woman begged him to allow her to finish cooking. To the gas man's horror, he noticed that, and this is graphic, but she was actually cooking the family dog. So times were very, very, very tough during the 1930s, right? A stark change from the 1920s. Marked change from the 1920s. Some suggested that Herbert Hoover, the president, was to blame, or maybe he was just blind. Surely he hadn't missed any meals himself and couldn't possibly fathom anyone on the brink of starvation. In reality, though, Hoover did make some efforts to provide aid to hurting families. Hoover had a Quaker upbringing and sincerely believed that people must help themselves. So we see that Hoover, right? I know sometimes he's characterized as someone who didn't care. That's really not the case. He cared, but his ideology really spoke to pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. And if you had some type of challenge or issue, it was really up to you and maybe even, right, some elements of the community to help, but certainly not the federal government. He thought that help would just trickle down to the less fortunate. And this idea does not go away. During times like the 80s, we'll hear a lot about trickle-down economics, and we will talk about that in the future. Hoover initiated small projects like the Hoover Dam to create jobs, but his efforts did not even begin to address the widespread poverty that took place during this time. Now, someone who had a very different idea of how government should help was Franklin D. Roosevelt. And he was elected president next in 1933. He was born in New York, attended Harvard College, and married Eleanor. He had contracted polio as a young person. So, just want to stop the share if I could. So he had his own physical challenges with his health. Roosevelt had served in the New York Senate as a Democrat. He had also been Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was the 44th governor of New York. In 1920, he was the vice president to James M. Cox's presidential candidacy. It is said that upon being elected in 1933, Roosevelt said to his son, "I am not sure if I'm the strong enough person to be president. I pray that I will be able to do this job and do it right." So just to do some reflection here, right? The 20s, the roaring 20s, right? Full of fun and full of excitement. There's some important things that happened. 18th Amendment, right? We cannot forget that forbade the sale, consumption of alcohol, which we might think is just totally crazy today, but at that time it was serious. The only problem was a lot of people did not abide by that rule. Even those, or at least some of those who were supposed to uphold those rules. So you had people buying bootleg liquor or making it or selling it or running it. So that 18th Amendment was appealed, right? And then we can't forget too, though, about women gaining the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, which was huge. Women have been fighting for the right to vote and rights in general for ages. We could say 1700s and upward. So that's a major change. And we also see the Jazz Age, right? The Harlem Renaissance, um, things that are coming and really things that are impacting the entire country, but that are coming out of the African American community and being disseminated out. So jazz, right, affected our music even today, right? We can't even pretend that our music isn't linked to those elements, the jazz age. Um, Also, though, we see African American thought in some ways changing. Some African Americans or people of African descent, like Marcus Garvey, saying, we've had so many challenges in this country. Maybe it's just time to move back to Africa, right? So Marcus Garvey and some others felt that was the best thing to do. However, in reality, a lot of African Americans did not agree with that. They had no clue about African, and this is African, the continent, right? The cultures, the different people, the different languages, no clue. They were Americans. So he had a following, but not a huge following. We also see at this time, though, groups, fringe groups like the KKK that have been around since the late 1800s, gaining more momentum as times change, as different people in different segments in the American population become more visible. Some folks, right, were thinking, in particular, an element of poor whites, especially, who may have felt very threatened, right, by seeing possibly more African Americans gain rights, gain success. That changing of the norms or changing of the status quo. So you had KKK membership rise or spike, and not just in the South, in various places. And we can talk more when we do our video together about lynchings as well. So even amidst all of this prosperity and all of these wonderful times in the 1920s, still some major things going on that maybe we don't talk about or think about that make me wonder, were these times really the best? Were they really so wonderful and exciting? So that's just my take on things. But you can't take away things like technology, the radio, the automobile or the car changing how we live, how we interact. Can you imagine not being able to ever be alone on a date, which was really, in a way, the case for a lot of young folks before the car? Or having to depend on, right, horse and buggy or your own 2 feet to get to work or to get to the store. So the production, right, thinking of Henry Ford, the mass production of automobiles that were really relatively affordable for people was a game changer. Just going through all of this, right, there were some underlying problems with how our society handled the economy. So we're thinking about the stock market crash. It didn't happen overnight. This is something that had been building up, which we'll talk more about. But if you have questions, please let me know. And what we're going to be doing starting Tuesday, we'll be starting our timeline and we'll be taking chunks. We're starting in the 1920s and 30s, but we will be filling in a timeline so you can also have a good frame of reference for your HiSET and GED tests. So you can know what happened 1619 and we can go all the way up through the 2000s. But we'll be doing that at different segments. It won't all be chronological. I think that might not be the best thing for us at this time. So if you have concerns or comments even, please let me know. I look forward to meeting with you on Tuesday at 10. Thank you.